The final major patch of set 11 is here for Inkborn Fables, and it is the most balanced and diverse meta maybe in TFT history, at least according to Mortdog.
Look at this meta right now. Look at this meta. There are 9 S tier comps, 10 A tier comps. There are plenty of things to play. It is goddamn one of the best metas TFT has ever had, and yet somehow you still have the audacity to come in here and go, I don't want to see Luxes. Luxes are scary. Go stick a freaking pencil in your.
Is that exactly true? Let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list and find out what conditions are required to make a lot of these comps tick. Starting off at the top of S tier is a composition you'll be seeing the most common. It's Reaper Bruisers. It's very consistent and it has a dynamic game plan because you can choose to reroll around Yone and Kindred 3 as a duo, or you can just straight up go to level 8 and play around Kayn and like 2-star your other 4 costs like Kayn Silas, and then slowly but surely rack up Yone 3 over time. And so because of the dynamic game plan around 4 Reapers being very flexible, you actually have many different outs that you can play for. The thing about Reapers is that you have to kind of make sure you have good augments for it. So you want to hit something like Grim Harvest or Not Today. Little Buddies is extremely good, but you're playing around Kayn and not Yone because Yone is not impacted at all by Little Buddies. Tiny but Deadly and Freaky Fight are the 2 best prismatic augments to pick for it. And you can also pick some other really good augments that just give you straight up combat power like Unified Resistance or Harm Assist, Healing Orb, things like that. The best opener in general is to play around the Umbral featuring around Darius. And then you have Darius be an item holder for Yone. Or you could have like Kiana hold items if you hit Kiana too, and then try to tempo around that. We do have Kindred with items here, but you only play on Kindred if you 2-star her early, and you also have items that are convenient to slam on Kindred. You're not going to like go out of your way to try to like finish a bunch of AP items for her. It's more like what happens if you get dropped a bunch of rods and tears. You put those items on Kindred and you save all the other swords and gloves and bows for all the melee carries. Part of the reason why this works so well with Bruisers is that Bruisers are a lot cheaper to help put the board together. Minus Wukong, you're basically just playing like Kindred, Yone, Kha'Zix early with some Umbral Heavenly, and then you pick up Rek'Sai and Aatrox, and then eventually just roll for like Galio and Silas, and it just fits in really, really nicely. Very simple 4 Reaper, 4 Bruiser. And Galio ends up being a really key part of the composition, and we have Vow here because the sooner Galio casts with Vow, the sooner you're going to get the effect where he drops aggro for your other carries. So Yone's getting attacked, for example, here. Galio casts, he taunts, the enemy carry stops attacking Yone and they attack Galio instead. If you have Not Today and you have like Edge of Night on like Yone and Kayn, then you can actually kind of have like 2 Edge of Nights. Yone drops the aggro once, then Galio taunts and he drops it a second time, so it ends up being really, really effective. And the reason why I'm pointing that out so much is because if you do end up dropping this core, like let's say you can't hit Galio and you can't hit Silas, you can play other units, but you have to make sure that there is some unit to help draw aggression and tank. So if you end up playing like fragile units like Heavenly, for example, with Heavenly Reaper, you might notice that, you know, Nico and Malphite die super fast, and then they target Yone, then he dies, and then you're just out a huge DPS unit. If you drop Rek'Sai for Ornn, you could drop Aatrox for Morgana, and then you get that time with Ghostly Sage. So you get the Omnivamp and maybe a little bit extra backline AP for Kindred and Morgana. So those are all different kinds of ways that you can use Reapers and be flexible with it with your game plan. So remember, there's 2 ways you can play. Roll at 7 for Yone 3 and Kindred 3, or go to 8 and roll for 4 costs and eventually pick up Yone 3 over time and make Kayn your primary carry. Even though we have it at the top of S tier, it's not going to be the strongest in terms of the cap potential. A lot of times this composition is going to farm like thirds, largely due to how effective it is once you're able to stabilize. But it does get outcapped, and there are some bad matchups. One said bad matchup is 7 Storyweaver. 7 Storyweaver counters Yone because they clump for the AoE from Kayle. Like Kayle just shoots in a bunch of ways and hits like their entire team. And so Kayle 3 ends up doing really well. We have green, blue, blue Kayle for Talisman of Aid, Scroll of Force, and Tome of Power, but you also could play red, blue, blue, or blue, 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 depending on your spot. The reason why we play green here is because it saves you the heartache of trying to build like a Shiv or Spark early, and you can focus on AP items for your Zoe. The key to Storyweaver, in my opinion, is playing around your early AP and not necessarily slamming AD items. A lot of times what people end up doing is slamming AD items on Sivir, like a Last Whisper, Runaan's, Rageblade, you know, whatever you want, and then trying to play around Kai'Sa, and then you play like 7 Storyweaver Kai'Sa. I think it's a lot weaker than trying to stabilize around AP because you're much more likely to hit 7 Storyweaver with a +1 Storyweaver crest. Like you're going to hit 7 Storyweaver with Gear and Sivir, and then Sivir holds the Irelia items, but then if you never hit Irelia and you're just holding on to all these 80 items, you're just going to lose a lot of fights in stage 4. So try to play around the early AP. Teemo, Zyra is fine. You can always replace Zyra later on with another unit, and you can go for Zoe 3 if you want, but that's kind of like Yone. You just pick up Zoe copies as time goes on and see if you can get for Zoe 3. Otherwise, you just go to level 8, level 9, look for Irelia or Rakan, and just play this core. Morgana just adds a lot to the team because you're having Alawi be a little bit tankier, and you also get the backline AP, which is really nice. Note the positioning. We have Galio as a solo frontline unit because we want units to funnel for the Kayle to try to AoE. And then keep in mind that late game situations, you might want to move things away from Kayle because she doesn't want to get targeted by clump AoE. So if your opponents have Lillia and Morgana, you have to be really careful. Also, if you do have Talisman Evade, one thing that's really nice is that she's positionally flexible. You don't have to position her like close to carries. You can have her just, buy herself in the center and then Zoe, Irelia farther away so you can protect her a little bit more. This positioning, by the way, is a little bit more vulnerable to like Lux. So if you do end up going against Luxes, have Irelia and Zyra switch. You can play Storyweaver without a Storyweaver emblem, but it's a lot harder. And the one way you can play something like Call to Adventure because you just snowball, but I wouldn't pick this unless you have 2-star Storyweavers in general. One thing to note as we start talking about like all these conditions, the reason why there's like all these different symbols to indicate like the conditions to play these comps is that you should be thinking about it if you already have an opener that includes some of those units or items. So what I mean by that is, let's say you get a Storyweaver Crest at 2-1, but you have no Garens, no Sivers, and you just get this Riven, then that's not going to be that useful because you're not going to hit 3 Storyweaver, and you don't have the upgrades to actually make that Kayle strong and tempo early. And that's going to apply to almost every other comp that we talk about. And just as a final note, in case you missed it in my previous tier lists, make sure that you pick up these combat augments because these all affect Kayle, like pumping ups for Kayle, magic wands for Kayle, Duelists for Kayle, and your whole team, but mainly Kayle. She is the carry, and then everyone else is the secondary carry. Sage, Lux, Janna. This is a comp that people call Dragon Lord Amumu because there was a data site that actually listed out this composition as a low play rate, and because it was so new and there was so little sample size, the only consistent force in the composition was Dragon Lord units and Amumu, so they called it Dragon Lord Amumu. So it caught on as a joke within the community because people kept saying, did you play or try out Dragon Lord Amumu, which just sounds dumb. The build is oriented around having Janna be built like a traditional AP carry. You want to give like Shojin, Nashers, and Archangel Staff. This is her BIS. But if you can't get, all these tiers and rods, maybe just go for a Death Cap or Jewel Gauntlet. It's like totally fine if you can't get this. But Shojin is really, really important. And then you give attack speed items to Lux. In this case, if you got to choose items with like Pandora's, another Shojin Nashers, and Shiv is really good. But a lot of times Lux holds things like Shojin and Red Buff and Shiv and Rage Blade. Like you can just give her like whatever. But I do want to emphasize that there's a reason why they call the Dragon Lord Amumu is because Amumu 3 in this composition is a terror. You play Amumu and you get 3 items on him. Don't skip out on frontline items. And you just watch him tank forever because he ends up just benefiting so much from all the support traits. And it's important to recognize that this composition is actually just trying to stall out fights. It's not trying to have like Lux one-shot the back line. And that's why we don't build like Death Cap and JG on Lux. You build attack speed because as you continue to cast, you're stalling out the composition and Janna is ramping while your frontline is stalling infinite. To kind of add in a little dynamic of rock, paper, scissors, it does tend to have a bad matchup against some melee comps because melee units can wrap around. You do want Amumu to be solo frontline because the units that wrap around him get more value off his ability. But as a result, you get more vulnerable to some of those comps that I mentioned, like, Kayn and Lee Sin. Also, like, Udyr sometimes can really be a mess. Like, sometimes units walk up, Annie stays here, Alawi stays here, Udyr walks to the side and then charges through and grabs your Lux. Just be very, very careful. The way to counter that is Diana to the top left corner, Alawi to the top right corner, or Annie, and then just spread out. Just ignore a little bit of your stone plate value. That's also something to note. You don't have to play stone plate if you end up going against a lot of melee people in the lobby because it's a little bit less about like, Ashe and other units focus firing Amumu, and it's more about stopping those melee carries. So you can go for like a straight front row line. Another thing about this composition is that you're going to roll really aggressively on 6 for basically these 6 units on the left and minus Annie and Morgana. Sometimes if you hit like 1 copy of Morgana and you don't have Zyra 2, you can just play Morg as your 6th unit with Lux, Janna, Alawi, Diana, and Amumu. But you're going to want to roll until you 2-star it. And that usually means you roll very aggressively. I've seen people roll to 0 and try to win stage 3 because you need to have that momentum of 2-star to streak all of stage 3 and stage 4 to preserve your HP. I think a lot of people are saying at the top level you want to itemize Janna first. So if you do have Shojin, you put Shojin, Nashers, Janna, and then you start working on frontline items, and then Janna 3rd item, then maybe some Lux carry items. But in reality, what ends up happening is you just kind of itemize whoever you're leaning into momentum-wise. And also, if you have Boiling Point, you probably itemize Lux. Lillia has stayed at the top, but only because she is a high cap composition. She's actually quite first or eighth these days. Very often, Lillia is either top 2 or bot 2 because her power level is largely gated by hitting a bunch of 4 costs and 5 costs. If you can get to the 4 Invoker board with Lillia, it is very good. I think it's more superior to the Sage Lillia that we'll talk about. That version has fallen all the way to B tier right now, and I'll explain why later. But for now, the best version that you want to play with Lillia is 4 Invoker, and you don't have to have blue buff when you play Invoker Lillia, but it is nice. I mean, it's just part of a really good setup if you can go for like big crit damage. And then you really want to activate like Vertical Mythic to get a bunch of base AP. The big thing is that Annie 2 is just a huge stabilization point for the composition. So on 8, you want to roll for Lillia 2, obviously, but Annie 2, support units. And if you can throw in the Mythic, great, but you can also tech them out. Sometimes you don't hit like Nautilus and Kog'Maw or even a Lowy because it's so hard, plus the 5 cost. So you can play Silas and a Loon, for example, and you get the Umbral and Bruiser with Tom Kench. Or you can always just play Janna, Diana, and Morgana and try to play a little bit more of that Sage variant until you get to the Mythic Invoker. And part of what makes this really strong is the Mythic Emblem, because if you don't have it, you have to play Bard, and that's just very, very weak. The best augment by far is Jewel Lotus 3. If you do get Jewel Lotus 3, you don't even really need Jewel Gauntlet. You can just build her like other AP items and just watch her destroy backlines. The other thing too is you want to have a lot of items, because in the ideal scenario, you have items for Lillia, Annie, some leftover items for Nautilus, and maybe like Hui/Azir, whoever's your 5 cost you 2-star. And so you just need a bunch of those items. If you want a more in-depth guide into Lillia, nothing pretty much has functionally changed from the Lillia guide I put out, other than maybe some of the prio and packaging. So check out that video where I called the S tier deer to talk about how to play Lillia Flex more in depth. Inkshadow's got a lot better this patch because they buffed 5 and 7 Inkshadow, and it might seem like a small buff, but it actually adds up to a lot because it's not just the damage reduction, but it's also damage bonus, and you kind of multiply that across 5 and 7 units, it adds up to quite some stats. Right now, the most common way to set up is to just play around Kai'Sa and Xayah. You play like Kai'Sa with, you know, the traditional trick shot board, Last Whisper, IE, and then if you get like Tattoo of Toxin, because you're going to get a lot of tattoos, you can slap it on her. Xayah is just really good, so if you get like these other tattoos, put it on her. If you get Udyr, you can always just give Udyr all these random items. But I will say that Inkshadow is more flexible than just like, okay, well, it's an Inkshadow, just throw it in. You can actually play Ghostly variants for like a long time and play 5 Inkshadow 4 Ghostly until you get to 9. Because the trick with this composition is how do you get to Udyr really safely? And there's a lot of like dead units in Inkshadow. Like Volibear doesn't do anything. Jax is a Warden, but he's not really doing much. Quite frankly, Senna's not really doing much either. So you're playing like a lot of useless units. We like to say reverse Fawns, like reverse Force of Nature, aka Tactician's Crown, like you're playing down 3 unit slots. But the trade-off is, if you can find ways to abuse these tattoos, it's really good. One combo I like in particular is Tattoo of Force on Silas. So if you get an Inkshadow tattoo, you can go for Inkshadow Emblem plus Tattoo of Force plus, I don't know, like Ionic Spark on Silas. Or even if you are able to get like the Giga combo, the true Exodia combo is Tattoo of Force, Inkshadow Emblem, and Suspicious Trenchcoat on Silas 2 with 7 Inkshadow. You can watch him go crazy. He's actually really, really fun to watch. It's surprisingly not easy to play because until you hit Kai'Sa 2 and like all these impactful units like Udyr and Xayah, you're going to have like early awkward mid games unless you hit like everything like Senna 2, Shen 2, Alawi 2. So you do have to like be a little bit more flexible, but the late game always tends to converge into something like this, either around Kai'Sa Xayah or around like a good Inkshadow tattoo holder. Another unit that I want to shout out to is Aurelia. I think Aurelia is also really good. If you can find a way to like 2-star Aurelia and put tattoos on her, she also can pop off with these items. 4 Trickshot variation of Kai'Sa is also good, not just Inkshadows. Kai'Sa buff in general just made her much more reliable. So you usually play this off of Fortune, but I think there's a belief that you can still play this even without, but you need to have like a good item portal or something to just give you a lot of items, because as you can tell, how do you get items for Galio, Kai'Sa, Xayah, and Silas and like Teemo? Speaking of Teemo, this is one of the more reliable ways to actually play Teemo Reroll, and I put that in quotation marks because a lot of times you're going to be rolling on 8 for Kai'Sa, Galio, and Silas, but you buy every Teemo in the process. So as you're buying every single Teemo, you might incidentally pick up Teemo 3, and if you itemize him, he can secretly be the MVP. Like I've had situations where I've had a setup like this, and I have 3 items on all these backliners, and Teemo is my highest damage DPS, not Kai'Sa or Xayah. So heavy win streak, Fortune, or yeah, even a great Exalted as well. There's like Kai'Sa Galio Exalted or other things you can do, and ends up being really powerful. I think Kai'Sa might be the 4 cost that benefits the most from Exalted, but it's one of the hardest to pull off. in terms of combos due to the rigidity of her board. She always wants 4 trick shot, and she kind of just wants good frontline, but a lot of times that frontline is like Bruisers plus 4 cost, so you don't really have that many options. But if you can get Exalted for her, it usually means a win of the lobby if you 2-star everything here and you get the Exalted in. Fast 9 is the same as before. You're mainly doing this if you are really far ahead and you have just infinite econ and you don't really have direction. You can just play like tempo into Fast 9, and it's just like Irelia Hui, Irelia Azir, and you throw in like Wukong. Just play like a lot of high value units. Very rare though, and honestly, I feel like I've talked about this comp like a lot throughout the set. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask in comments. But for the most part, it's just like a composition for you to play for if you are just really far ahead and you're trying to ladder your composition higher. What I mean by that is sometimes you might be in a situation where you're trying to play with something like Lillia and you have like, you know, blue buff and death cap and some of these other items, and you roll, and let's say you hit like Lillia 1, but you 2-star like everything else. You can 2-star Morgana, or you 2-star Annie, Nautilus, and you're just like, man, this is like kind of hard to roll just for Lillia 2, so I want to go to level 9 because I can't just roll for one unit when I have such a lead and I have a bunch of HP. You get to 9, you look around, there's like 2 Lillia 2s out of the pool, and it just doesn't feel like you're going to hit Hui. But you do have things like, you know, Diana, Janna, because you're playing like the Sage Core, and you can play around that Dragon Lord. A lot of times you can actually transition over to like this Dragon Lord Irelia build instead and find a way to do a cool pivot. It's very hard to do something like that, but that's like one scenario that you might play something like this if you're not just taking like a straight up econ augment. But other than that, I really wouldn't waste much of my time because this is just like a composition that does well due to the fact that you have so many 5 costs and it always looks good in the data. But that's like the reason why it's S tier, because it has a bunch of survivorship bias. The reality is it's just kind of hard to pull this off unless you are very good at the game. Storied Champion Garen is still really good, but it might look bad in the data. And that's only true if you look at Diamond. If you look at Diamond Plus, it's 4.5 and it's kind of like a losing augment. But if you go to Masters Plus, it becomes a 4.46. It's improving its placement. And then finally, if you go to GM Plus, it looks like it's actually like an S tier augment. And so that's why we have it here towards the bottom of S tier, because we think that this is an augment that ends up doing much better if you know how to play it. Specifically, the fact that you have to itemize correctly around Garen. Stop building things like Bloodthirster and try to prioritize Dragon's Claw with like Archangels and Titans. And if you can't get Archangels, try to go for Asterisk Gauge. But if you can get all those 3 items and you can get to the 3-star Garen with the 6 Wardens, it just becomes very, very impressive. There's also other artifacts to think about with Garen. If you can get the Talisman, Silvermere Dawn, or Innovating Locket, these are also really good win conditions for Garen. So yeah, I think the stats are so bad because people are just not playing around Garen's items correctly, and they're just like not really thinking and trying to just build like, you know, Titans BT, and then Garen just gets overrun. It's a 1-cost reroll, so stay at level 4 to roll early to try to collect as many Garens as possible. And if you have any other questions about the comp, just check out this Garen Hero Augment video I did a patch ago where he was very good. And yet he's weaker, but most of those principles still apply, even though the game's a little bit high roll. Lastly, in S tier, we have Built Different. It finally got a couple of big buffs, and now it is viable again. Built Different is anchored mainly around 2 4-cost AD carries, which is Kai'Sa and Ashe. If you have like Rage Blade, you play around Ashe, and if you have like a lot of just sharp AD items, you play around Kai'Sa, like Infinity Edge GS. Melee carries are also viable, like Kayn, and you could play around AP carries, but in general, it's considered weaker, so I would not advise that. But, you know, if you get something like Shojin and Morello and whatnot, you can always put items on Hui or Aurelia. Hui sounds like he wouldn't be that good of a unit because his traits deactivate Built Different, but he's actually really good because he is, one, just a solid unit to play on the board. He's 5 cost at AoE and heals your team, and also he prints 4 costs, which is really powerful, and it's just hard to activate Mythic, even if you have Nautilus. And Hui is just a good late game AP dump holder as well. The other thing to think about with Built Different is people often just focus on like 2 carry items and they stop building frontline items, but you really want to have a 2-star frontliner with 3 items. So a lot of times you're going to build like 1 carry, 1 tank, and then start working on a secondary carry. So if you play like Ashe Ornn, then you just start working on Kai'Sa items and Kayn items later. The one thing to note is that Lissandra is also another 5 cost you can play around, but you can't really play it unless you get rid of Ashe. So keep that in mind based on your board building. But a lot of it is just, you know, good fundamentals, play upgrades. These are some like examples of units you can play, like Darius, Zyra, Lux, Shen, Soraka. They're all just solid units that have good utility and are benefiting from things like attack speed and extra HP. Senna is back on top of A tier, and that is because of the meta being favorable to Senna. She was kind of hovering towards low B tier for a while due to the fact that not many people were just rerolling, but now because so many people are pulling 2-cost, Lux Janna, or going for a bunch of Caretaker's favor with like Teemo, maybe pulling Kindreds out of the pool, Senna ends up being really good, and there's a less prominent amount of people playing Zoe Zyra Ghostly reroll, so you should be less contested on these units. And so it just capitalizes on rolling at the same time as a lot of other people, which is just a good fundamental lesson of like how to think about when reroll will be good. Some reroll comps get a lot better if other reroll comps are in the meta. And so Senna just ends up matching tempo with a lot of comps, rolling on 6, 2-starring Senna, Shen, and Alawi, and then pushing levels. If you can get Senna 3, Shen 3 with items and get 6 Ghostly online, you oftentimes can snowball your lead because you just end up crushing a lot of comps that aren't able to deal with your Shen frontline, and you have inevitability due to Ghostly. Senna's best in slot is Last Whisper, IE, plus Tattoo of Bombardment, but you can also play Tattoo of Fury as well. You also could play like Red Buff, probably could get away with like a Giant Slayer as well, but you might be lacking a little bit of damage. Or you can put like Last Whisper on Caitlyn, and then put a third item on Senna. Another unit worth noting is Caitlyn 3. Sometimes she ends up being really clutch. Sometimes she ends up sniping a backline unit, ends up clutching fights, and then she ends up being like the top damage dealer, just due to the fact that she can also just put out the pain if you just put 3 items on her. So if you're in a late game situation and you have Caitlyn 3, just slap some items on her and you'll be surprised. Some conditions that I would look for Senna, it would be like pumping up, attack speed, 2 healthy. Haunted House is very, very good for her as well. Featherweights, these are all things that are just end up being very good for her. And the last thing to note is that try to stack your Ghostlies to attack on the same side. There's a reason why Kayn is here, is because you want all the Ghostlies to have their specters on the same target so you can focus fire your Ghostlies. Bard reroll is continuing to improve. Every time I see people have a Bard spot, it's usually like a first place. This comp basically has like the highest win rate out of any of the reroll comps, but its average placement is low because a lot of people are playing it from spots that aren't actually that good for it. But at high elo, people are often just top 2 or better with Bard, because if you have the good setup with it, you know, Forbidden Idol, Locket, Eternal Winter on Tom Kench, or Radiant Stoneplate, and you have like Wits End Bard, you just pretty much steamroll everything if you can hit. You don't need to go for Zoe 3 and Soraka 3, but those are just like other ways to cap the board if you're just rolling on 8 forever and you can't get to 9. But if you can get to 9 and play like Rakan and Wukong, that's a really good way to cap out. Bard really loves things like March of Progress, pumping up 3, Lucky Ricochet. He's also a really big fan of Pandora's, because not only can you get things like Rage Blade, but you can also reroll your artifacts. And you have so many different artifacts that you can get. In fact, one augment we should probably put on here as well is Living Forge, which is the ability to get a bunch of different artifacts. It's a prismatic augment that starts off at 2-1 and every 8 combats, I believe, afterwards. Just roll on 7 for Bard 2 and Tom Kench 2 and stabilize your board, and then just you come back up, slow roll, hit your 3 stars, and win. Ashe is definitely back this patch. They buffed snipers and reverted the nerf from the previous patch, and so Ashe is very good, and if you're able to get 6 snipers specifically, 6 sniper is just copious amounts of damage that your opponent can't deal with, even to the point where you'd rather play 3 Warden, 6 sniper on level 8. Another thing worth thinking about is you can now go for Aphelios 3 more often as well, because they did buff the odds on 7. I have seen people roll for Aphelios 3 as the primary item holder while giving leftover items to Ashe, but I don't think that's something you do very often. It's more like you're oftentimes just trying to play around Ashe, and sometimes every now and then you try to primary Aphelios or just give Aphelios 3 items. Combat augments are really important for Ashe. Really important for Ashe. You really want things like Long Shot, Sniper Crown, Pumping Up, Best Friends. Spirit Guardians is also good, like these trait-specific things. If you do get Warden Crest, you can go for 6 Warden and 4 Snipers, but it's just generally a little bit weaker than 6 Sniper. A lot of times if you hit the Sniper off of a target dummy, let's say you get it off a Wandering Sentinels, you probably want to play off the Sniper, because then you fix a little bit of the issue with your front line. If you have like a dummy that's a sniper, then you get to go stick sniper, and you have now, 5 units in your front line, which is really good, and snipers just need that distance. Use your first bow for Rage Blade. Do not use it for Last Whisper, and then eventually get to Last Whisper. Sometimes you do end up in a spot where you don't get Last Whisper at all, but don't worry. Aphelios has some Sunder built into his kit. It's not the end of the world, and you can also sometimes build Even Shroud. Duelists got a sizable nerf and then fell to B tier, and then over the course of the tournament patches since then, we actually recognize that Duelists were still really good. But the only thing is that they're much more conditional to like having a good augment for it. So like you don't want to play it without like Keepers or Combat Caster, Unified, or like, Find Vintage is really, really good for Duelists as well. You just basically want to have like a good augment. So Duelists are more like an augment check now. But the cool thing about Duelists is that it's a little bit like Reapers. You actually have many different game plans that you can make work now. You You can play Lee Sin 2 and support him with, you know, vertical duelists and play like Lee Sin Irelia duo. Maybe get some fine vintage thrown in there. You can also play around reroll Tristana and Volibear again. People have figured out that's also a 3 cost that you can roll for. They buff the 3 cost odds. You know, other people are playing Bard and Tom Kench, or maybe they're playing like Yone's out of the pool. You can go and roll for other 3 costs and play around those 2. Or you can actually play around like Kiana 3 as a primary, and then like you have like Kiana Lee Sin as a duo and throw in like whatever on Irelia late game and just have Kiana tempo. And that's usually off of things like a Caretaker's Ally, which gives you a copy of Kiana for each level that you upgrade. Or you can just like naturally roll for Kiana 3 because maybe just people aren't playing her. Kiana's just not very popular unit unless you're playing specifically Heavenly. And even then, a lot of the Heavenly comps are AP and they're not throwing Kiana in. Like Lillia, for example, plays around Heavenly, but they don't splash in Kiana very often. So Duelists are much more dynamic, and because of its versatility, and there are a lot of ways you can activate Duelists as a condition, it ends up being quite good and ends up being like firmly in A tier. Heavenly Kayn is also really good, but this comp is pretty high roll. I would say that for the amount of Reaper games you play, you're probably playing Heavenly Kayn like twice at most, because you just need like the setup for Kayn. To take a step back, what is Heavenly Kayn trying to do? It's trying to turn Kayn into the 1v9 machine. The whole team is just supporting Kayn as the hyper carry. And so you have to have like all your augments to set up for Kayn. Like Not Today, Little Buddies, and Fine Vintage. Like that's all just trying to make Kayn the super carry. So if Kayn is the team, it's just one of those things that you just have to have like the augments lined up perfectly, and you have to hit the Kayn, and you have to have like, you know, the Heavenly setup. But if you can get 7 Heavenly with Kayn and get all things working and chugging along, it's very, very good. Last of all, the 4 cost, but not least, is Dryad Faded Syndra. She took a pretty sizable nerf by having the bonus damage from her Faded pairing alongside Ahri's AP pairing reduced. You were pairing both Ahri and Syndra, so now you're losing AP and bonus damage, so it did scare a lot of players. And the data still looks kind of bad on Faded Syndra. If you actually look at it right now on like tactics.tools or meta TFT, it's saying it's a 4.9 with like a 42% win rate. But I'm telling you that this comp is better than that. It's just that you can't get away with trying to play this line as a fallback default composition if you don't have the spot for it. In the past, the comp was so powerful that if you didn't really have that good of a spot, but if you hit the units, you were hard stabilized anyways. Like you could have like Shojin, Guard Breaker, and like Red Buff, and like, you know, Shiv, just like suboptimal stuff across the board. But if you hit everything, you would just hard stabilize and win. Now you kind of just need like the good setup. You need to have like a good early Dryad stack setup. You need to have like Kindred holding good items, eventually hit, you know, everything and looking for Ornn 2, get good augments for it, Jewel Lotus, Baboom, so on and so forth. If you get the good conditions for it, it still wins lobbies totally fine. In a lot of scrims for regionals and upcoming tournaments, people are still winning lobbies with Dryad Faded Syndra. It's just a harder comp to play now, so it's not just, you know, face roll, like, you know, buy every Faded unit, buy every Dryad unit, and then just hope that you hit Syndra 2 or 2. You need to put a little bit more thought into it. Umbral Flex might be the most underrated vertical in the game. Like, a lot of people still just don't play it that often, but I think the reason why it's hard to play now is because Sylas is just so contested. Sylas has played in Reapers and Bruisers. He's played in Kai'Sa Trickshot. He's played in Faded lines because you want to grab him. He's also a flex unit in Sage. So Sylas is just like the hardest 4 cost to hit. Even though his play rate isn't the highest, I think Nautilus is the highest 4 cost play rate right now. Sylas just feels like the hardest 2-star. And so it's more difficult to build your game plan if you're just not going to hit one of the core units in the comp. But if you do hit Wrath of the Moon and you do hit, you know, Umbral Crown or Umbral Crest, you definitely can try to play for it and try to anchor yourself around a Loon. Make sure Loon has that AP source like Archangels or Deathcap. If you just go like, you know, Shojin, JG, Nashor, she's not going to deal that much. You want her to have like a lot of AP. Kog'Maw. The early condition for Kog'Maw is you have like Tears, Kog'Maws, Cho'Gaths, and you have like a high econ augment that goes well with it, like Too Much Candy or something else that's just really good for it. It's surprisingly pretty powerful because the top end is so good for a 1 cost because you're playing around Hui, Lillia, and Nautilus. And if you also get like Caitlyn 3, she can really pop off as well. Very simple comp. Still probably the best reliable 1 cost reroll comp in the game. There are a couple other variants like the hero augments or Kha'Zix, but in general, it's pretty much just the same. You just want to like slow roll at stage 3 above 50 gold and try to get Kog'Maw 3, Cho'Gath 3, and Caitlyn 3. Malphite 3 is kind of a bonus, but, you know, sometimes you just give him random extra items and he ends up like holding over your mid game. The difficulty with this composition is that it's hard to win stage 3 now because a lot of people roll on 6. And so if you go up against like Lux and Diana, you go up against Senna, you're going up against a bunch of people that roll on 6, you're a little bit less likely to streak if you don't hit your 3 stars. But if you can streak stage 3 and stage 4, find a way to get to 8 by stage 5 and, you know, get the whole board together, this comp can actually do well enough and win. It's kind of like a snowball win more comp. Item priority is blue buff Nashers and then Spark onto Cho'Gath and then start building the rest of the items that you see here. And one thing to keep in mind, Cho'Gath is a anti-heal unit, so you don't need to build things like Morel that quickly, but it'll be nice to get it eventually later on. Big Mo. Teemo Reroll with Lux and Wardens. This comp capped really high, but the main condition is you need Blighting Jewel and you need, you know, blue buff and Nashers. You need really good items and you need to get good frontline. But hitting this frontline is like impossible this patch. So a lot of times we are going to hit Big Mo with, you know, the Kai'Sa Bruiser setup we talked about, or maybe re-rolling around just Bruisers in general. So this composition is going to be really hard to pull off. I did talk about it in my 5 comps you need to know how to play, and I put this on the list. So check out that video if you want more information about how to play Teemo Reroll. Other than that, though, it's pretty much just like Lux Janna, but instead of playing the Janna Diana, you play Wardens and Teemo. And then you just like play around that for the most part. Just roll on 6, hit as much as you can. Teemo items first, then frontline, and then Lux takes whatever is left over. Kabuko's hero augment, Lucky Paws, is still pretty good, especially if you are able to snowball with it. I end up seeing this do really well on portals that just give you a lot of Kabukos, like maybe the upgraded champion or 3 1 costs, and then you get like a bunch of Kabukos early, and then you hit the hero augment. That's usually how you snowball. Best in slot items are Dragon's Claw and then Redemption. And then third item is usually Bramble, or you can play like Spark. Backline doesn't really matter as long as you have a consistent form of DPS. Kabuko can't do it by himself. And if you don't have Kabuko and Silas, sometimes you just need that backline DPS. Sometimes you see Morgana because you have like, you know, the Ghostly, and then you tag in the Sage like Zyra for the Storyweaver. But, you know, in the high cap situation, I really think the 0 very, very good. Once you hit Kabuko 3 from rolling, you want to push to level 9 as fast as you can and try to get to the 5 cost. And if you can get to 8 Bruisers, it's really good. Otherwise, play 6 Bruiser plus good units. Last in the A tier is the Shen hero augment, Ethereal Blades. Double Rage Blade, Bramble. The condition obviously is the hero augment, but you also really need to have good items for Shen. Shen's also really good with some artifacts like Death Defiance or Talisman of Ascension, so keep that in mind. And you're just going to go for 6 Behemoth and roll for Shen 3. Now, there's other things to consider. You can also play Shen in the second row once you get Sage online. So a lot of times you're putting him in the back row, but once you get Sage, feel free to put Shen in the second row. And also, Shen wants to generally be on the same side as the enemy carries to try and kill this front line and then eventually target the back line. So just keep Shen positioned accordingly. But this is pretty straightforward and very fun on augment. If you haven't given it a chance yet, just try it out. Probably one of the best hero augments I think they've done this set. We're now in B tier territory, and B tier is largely defined by it can do well, but it just needs a lot more things to go right than the S and A tier comps. S is like the least amount of conditional stuff, and A is like, you know, the second most conditional, and B just requires like 3 things usually. So in this case, the 3 conditions for Sage Lillia is 1, you have to be rich as hell. You have to just be able to hit this entire board. It's like a bunch of 5 costs and 4 costs. 2, you have to have a bunch of items. And 3, you have to be playing from ahead, because playing this composition from behind can be really tricky since you generally have to weigh the risk and reward of rolling on 8 and stopping while getting to 9. So you can play this comp from behind, especially if you want to play even riskier stuff like playing it out of Fortune Cash Out or something like What Doesn't Kill You. But in general, you want to play it from ahead. Combat augments are also really important, so that's kind of like another half condition. Duelist 3, we talked about being really good. We want to have really good items for it. But it's pretty much the same thing as like Mythic Invoker Lillia, but this is what you play if you just don't get the Mythic emblem. Another thing to note is that because you're playing Lillia Morgana, which is a little bit more on the AoE damage side, sometimes you struggle to have the single target DPS to actually kill a unit. So if you're playing against like Heavenly Kayn or like the, you know, the Yone that jumps to the back, you can struggle in those matchups. A new composition, Princess and the Toad. This is a fun composition that is trying to fuse 2 lines between like the Zoe Altruist Sage boards as well as like Bard Tahm Kench, but instead of playing Bard, you're dropping it and you're playing 2 out of 3 Mythic. The concept is that Tahm Kench 3 is really, really powerful, and if you can get to Zoe 3 and maybe even Soraka 3 with the Altruist healing, it ends up sustaining Tahm Kench a lot, and then you have a bunch of AP burst. And you're rolling for 3 costs, which is really nice if you are playing off of somebody else's 3 cost rerolls. Not to be too much self-ad glazing, but you know, we have a testimonial section where people can kind of talk about like what's been working for them from TFT Academy, and someone actually won a tournament playing this. They actually played, you know, Princess and the Frog to win their final game and win the tournament. So, you know, it's one of those things to definitely check out. I think the conditions is just that you have to have a lot of resources to hit this, and you have to have like good augments for the AP units, you know, like your magic wands and your combat caster and your Jewel Lotus type stuff. But if you have a spot for it, give it a try and let me know how it goes. So they technically buffed Gnar by having Mulch be better, but he generally feels harder to pull off. I think it's because just the ancillary units get contested a lot, so it's like hard to kind of hit Ornn. There's more ghostly rerolls, so it's going to be hard to hit like Shen 3. Alawi's just still a nightmare. Kindred, with all the Reaper players, are going to be hard to 3-star, so it's just going to be difficult to get Gnar with his supporting cast. You might hit Gnar 3, but you'll still be a little bit disappointed unless you get the artifact setups. The artifact setups that you want are Corrupted Vampiric Scepter with Rage Blade and Quicksilver, or Silvermere Dawn with things like Bloodthirster and Hand of Justice. I cover this more in depth with the artifact comp, so check out that video if you want more information. But in general, I would say this composition is probably going to fall towards the bottom of B tier. It just feels too conditional, and too many of his friends are just popular, way more popular than him. Ghostly AP reroll has fallen off a lot because I think people have realized that you're just not nearly as stable on your 2-stars anymore because people are rerolling. Part of what made this strong earlier in the meta for previous patches was that it was one of the only comps that was like rolling on 6 and trying to stabilize. But now that's not really the case, and people are taking more of your units, and you kind of just need to hit like everything. It almost feels like Lillia in reroll form, where you need to have everything upgraded, and you need to have 2 carries itemized and a frontline tank itemized, and you have to have good augments. It's just like a little too much going on for it to be consistent. But if you hit like Prismatic Ticket and you're able to like get this online, I've seen people still do well with it, but it also struggles in late game situations versus comms that can really easily deal with their backline damage and just AoEs them down. Bruiser Flex, the main condition for this is Bruiser +1, but the power level of it just caps a lot lower. What makes it fun to play is that there's just, you know, some unique augments that are really good, like Well Fed, or you play like heavy hitters with Bruisers is just fun. Martyr, Unified Resistance, everything that just synergizes with it. And if you can get Bruiser Emblem on like a Kayn or an Irelia, just other AD units, you get to just play a really fun, fat idiot 8 Bruiser setup and just, you know, donk people as hard as you can. Arcanists are good, but good luck hitting Alawi 3, Lux 3, Amumu, and even Zoe. I mean, honestly, this is just becoming like the tier where there's all different kinds of Zoe 3s. Like we have Zoe 3 with Arcanist, Zoe 3 with Ghostly, and Zoe 3 with Tom Kench. This is just like the Zoe tier now that I'm like looking at it a little bit closer. And this Zoe, this Zoe variations condition is basically, surprise, surprise, just Arcanists. If you can find Arcanists and get 8 Arcanists online, if you can get the 3-star frontline, it can do well. I've seen it snowball and be able to get to like set Lysandra and pop off that way. But there's also a huge chance that you're just stuck on 7 and 8 rolling for Arcanists and you're just playing for top 4. That being said, like the Arcanist crown stats are really good because you get a static Shiv, and this is now a Zoe, not a Lux. So you just get like a strong opener. So you usually play Arcanist from high tempo, win streak, and then bleed out to a top 4. Sage Silas Flex. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. At one point, this comp was S tier, but now it is here in low B tier. And that's because Silas is the hardest unit to hit, in my opinion. Just you're not going to 2-star him. If you do 2-star him, usually you're trying to pair him with another backline carry that isn't Morgana, but a lot of times you do play Morgana and into Hui. They did buff Hui recently, so it's really good. But a lot of times, if you're like hitting this, you're either playing a different backline carry like Kai'Sa, or you're playing Reapers, or you're playing this into Fast 9, you want to play around a lot of 5 costs. It's just harder to hit, and it's so expensive, and that's part of why it's B tier. It just doesn't feel very reliable of a game plan. Neeko's Hero Augment Drop Blossom might be the most underrated comp. I actually think that if you can hit Neeko 3 and get everything online with good items, Neeko 3 and the Mythics, I think she actually is low S tier and can just straight up win the game if other people are caught lacking in damage to take her down. But the difference is that the gap between Neeko 2 and Neeko 3 is so huge. And so it's really hard to hit her. And then the other thing is Neeko is hard to grab these days. You know, if people are playing things like the Sage, Lillia, or they're playing Neeko and Heavenly, it's just hard to grab Neeko 3. She's just a really good 2-cost frontliner now that's splashing a bunch of different traits. So it's just hard to get her to 3-star. Yorick, on the other hand, I think is deservedly in B tier. I don't think very highly of this hero augment anymore. Yorick 3 itself is just a weak unit, and the reason why it would do well is because Umbral is good and because Loon is good. So if you can get Yorick 3 and you can get all these 3-star units, it's great. But the problem is that you don't want to stay low level rolling for Yorick. You want to roll for him at 6, but rolling for a 6 means that you're less likely to hit a Loon. Rolling at 7 means you're not really going to hit things like sets and all these forecasts very commonly. So you want to roll at 8. And then you kind of see where I'm getting at. It's a little bit awkward to go for the vertical Umbral game plan. There is some discussion about whether or not you want to play vertical behemoths with Yorick. I'm not exactly convinced by it, but something worth experimenting if you want, kind of like what Shen's hero augment does. And then you play like, a Loon with only 2 Umbral instead. Okay, now we are in C tier territory, and C definitely means very conditional. I mean C for conditional. Let's start off with one of the biggest meme comps that's recently come out called Big Banana. Big Banana is predicated on frontline Soraka. That's right. You want to frontline a traditional backline AP carry and itemize her like a bruiser. Bloodthirster, Adaptive are her 2 core items, and then you go for things like Hand of Justice to add some extra damage and healing, which ends up being really good if you want to play like, Idealism and you tag her with Zoe. Zoe 3 is the other situational carry. We keep finding ways to just put Zoe 3 as a conditional reroll carry, but you can also frontline the Zoe as well if you don't have mana items. Because if you have Zoe take aggression, she ends up getting mana and then casting. But you don't want her to take the main aggression, so you want to sandwich her between other units. Ghostly Flex is still a composition you can play, and it's largely based around playing like a vertical Ghostly, like 8 Ghostly. You often play this if you get like a +1 Ghostly on a trainer, and then you get like a Ghostly emblem, so you can play 8 Ghostly. You play loot subscription, or you get a spatula start, you can get 8 Ghostly. Or the other way that you play it is if you miss on like Senna Reroll, or even worse, you're contested, you just want to push levels, you can actually end up like playing into the Ghostly line and then just playing around like Kai'Sa instead and have Senna be an item holder. Because you end up using the same items like Last Whisper, IE, and then you just push into a Ghostly Flex situation. The other cool things about this, you can play other Ghostly units, you can play Ashe, you can actually even play things like, 5-cost Irelia and whatnot. So it all kind of depends on what you're hitting, and that's what makes it flexible. The last of my conditional artifact comps, I promise I'm going to stop spamming this, but check out that video if you haven't already. Revive Kayle, which is capitalizing off of Suspicious Trenchcoat and Vow. When Lissandra splits, it actually counts as a death, so the Tome of Mending will revive that strongest ally being defined by whoever has the most items. And so Lissandra comes back, she splits again, and then you have like a ton of Lissandras on the board. I actually made a video about this composition, about Soju playing it, so check that out. Some of the most fun and broken combos you've ever seen. He actually had a third piece of that combo. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's what made it put way over the top, and it's one of the most broken combos I've ever seen. You just play a Storyweaver setup, and eventually you put these items onto other units over time. Like you can put it on a Ornn, you can put it on a Stylist, you can put it on a bunch of units that you feel like you can get value, and then eventually you find Lissandra, and then you win the game. Invoker Ash. I'm not a fan of this comp anymore for the most part. I've seen people try it, but it's basically a fusion between Ashe and Lillia lines, and you want to anchor it around Porcelain Annie. I think the only time this works is if you get 6 Porcelain, and you get things like Boiling Point, and you have like a bunch of 80 items. Because the thing is, if you get like a Boiling Point start, why not just play like, Lux Janna? And the answer to that is probably you're in a spot where like 2 other people are playing it, and you picked Boiling Point, it's too late, and you have a bunch of 80 items. Maybe you play this line instead. But its stats are terrible, and it generally hasn't done well in tournaments, so I would advise against it. Kabuko no Hero Sivir is still the best named comp in this entire set, especially because the most recent season of My Hero is hitting, at least for me. I really like the storylines. I'm liking the plot threads. I'm enjoying the anime season. I'm enjoying this comp. It's basically rolling around Sivir 3, Kabuko 3 with no hero augment, hence Kabuko no Hero as a play on words. And then maybe you play Big Mo with it. Maybe the Blighting Jewel comes in here, and maybe you play Teemo Sivir 3, Kabuko 3, and you stop chasing after the Wardens. This is one way you can play it. Give it some thought. I did a video with an Into Deep of this comp being played if you want to check it out. It's fun stuff. Riven Reroll with Innervating Locket and tank items or Silvermere Dawn is a viable line. I don't think many people know about this comp, but it is something that every now and then people bust out. And at this point of the set, we're just using C tier to give you meme options if you just really want to have fun. So, check out Riven Reroll if you want. You roll on 6 for Riven 3, and because you're rolling for 2 costs, you can hit Zyra 3, maybe even Aatrox 3. I mean, who knows at this point? Aatrox 3 got buffed so many times, patch over patch. Maybe you just go for the trifecta. Kha'Zix Reroll is probably actually a comp we might promote from C tier, funny enough, because more and more people are playing Divine Rolls into Kha'Zix and 4 Reaper. So this isn't actually a meme. This is actually quite good now because they buff 4 Reaper. I've seen people get like Divine Rerolls, Grim Harvest, Reaper +1, and win the game. It's just like they snowball and get out of control. So instead of going for like Yone 3 and playing around Bruisers, you're playing like Heavenly Kha'Zix with Reapers, and you just have Kha'Zix Kayn duo carry. Very nasty. So give it a try if you have a Divine Rolls. You can also play it off Build-A-Bud, where you get Kha'Zix 3 early. It doesn't matter. As long as you find a way to get Kha'Zix 3 quickly, you're good to go. And this is kind of like the swan song of like Heavenly Find Vintage. Pretty much nobody plays this variation anymore, but we keep it here in case you ever feel like taking a trip down memory lane. This was once at the top of S tier as being like the best comp in the game, but it's just been nerfed and neutered and diluted so many times over the course of the patches, and then they reworked Heavenly. That's not really a thing. Most people take Find Vintage and just play it into Duelists or play into Reapers now. But yeah, if you want to get one final go at this kind of setup, it's really fun still to go for the ZZ Rod Army Void Spawn things and just take over the comp. So there you go, my final video on Inkborn Fables for the comp tier list. It's been a really fun set, but there's also been some, pretty bad patches. I want to be fair. I think the meta that we have is pretty well balanced and there's a lot of things viable, but I think my problem with it is that a lot of things are locked by the conditions. I mean, I went through 35 comps and I feel like 30 of them are conditional. So that doesn't feel good if you're a player that, one, doesn't spend time studying everything in the game, and then 2, if you're a player that just wants to play a comp that like wants to have fun with, like if you can't play Storyweaver because you don't have the emblem, that just feels bad. If you want to play Bard but you don't have the artifacts and you just kind of get stomped, like it's like a 5.0 without it, but like a 3.0 with it, that feels bad too. So I hope that in the future we make things less like you have to have these perfect conditions to play the comp, otherwise you can't play them. I feel like that takes out a little bit of the fun of, exploring, and it just adds a lot more rigidity to the game. That being said, it's one of the most diverse and balanced metas we've ever had. I do want to acknowledge that. So I think in the end, if you love playing something new every game, this is the patch for you. That's it for me. Thanks for watching all my videos here in Set 11, and I'll see you next set.